on our country. And, oh yeah, before I begin, speaking as a Fed president, there is something else I need to do, the standard Fed disclaimer. So the views I express today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else on the Federal Open Market Committee or in the Federal Reserve System. So please don't say the Fed said, you can say Pat Harker said, and that's cool. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we're meeting today on this beautiful campus. Even though we've made sizable leaps in the use of technology in recent years, especially, I think, accelerated because of COVID-19, the pandemic, higher education institutions and hospitals are still physically embedded in their communities. In fact, that's one of the reasons, that is the reason we call them anchor institutions. In multiple ways, eds and meds are tied to a specific place. Unlike corporate headquarters, manufacturing facilities, or sports teams that can pick up and move, apologies to anybody from Oakland. I mean, this is not a good time for Oakland today. Higher education institutions and hospitals generally stay where they are. You quite literally can't take Greensboro out of UNC Greensboro. Now, there are other specific attributes that anchor these institutions in their communities. For one, hospitals and higher education tend to be labor intensive, meaning they're often among the largest, if not the largest, employer in their regions. Healthcare is in fact the largest single employment category in the United States, with more than 16 million people working in the field. Eds and meds also serve as a bulwark against the ups and downs of the business cycle. Enrollment in colleges and universities, for instance, is generally counter-cyclical, meaning that when the economy slows, more people go to school, boosting anchor institutions. Hospitals are also somewhat recession resistant. After all, people require medical care no matter how the local economy or the national economy is faring. All of which suggest that regions with strong anchor institutions may have more durable economies than those without. And in recent years, we've also seen anchor institutions taking up an increasing interest in building up the areas they serve. They are typically critical partners in community development initiatives as part of their missions. We've seen more hospitals and universities invest in neighborhood economic development, boosting local commercial corridors, seeding residential real estate development, and building even neighborhood amenities like parks. I don't know how many of you get to Philadelphia, but the next time you do, make sure you check out University City near the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel. That neighborhood is now quite literally unrecognizable from what it was like when I was an undergrad there, which admittedly was the Stone Age, I guess, but it was a long time ago. Anchor institutions' impact goes beyond, though, the immediate. This is a key point that I really want to stress. Fundamentally, anchor institutions stimulate growth through innovation, commercialization, new venture formation, and talent attraction, just like you saw in that video that played just before we started. In that sense, they can not only solve immediate problems or deal with immediate issues, but drive long-term economic development and growth. I see this in Philadelphia all the time. The talent and research coming out of our universities and healthcare systems has led to a booming biotechnology industry in the region. Our real estate developers, for example, can't put up enough wet lab space. They can't do it fast enough. And our labs are hiring new grads straight out of school. And also not just people with a four-year degree, but also lab techs and other roles that can be part of this biotech revolution. Which is to say, anchor institutions are not only often the largest employer themselves in the region, they're also the producer of talent that other businesses need. So when I give speeches on a country's economic outlook, I often speak about downside risks. So I would be remiss if I did not mention that there are risks to regions whose economies rely heavily on anchor institutions, because there are risks to those institutions themselves. Eds and meds are both being radically disrupted by technology, demographic shifts, and increasing costs. I mean, you talk to anybody in higher ed or in healthcare, the cost issue is pretty dramatic right now. As I alluded to earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated both telehealth and remote learning. This has certainly created opportunities for health systems and universities to expand markets. But in some ways, it also may have loosened the place-based nature of those services. All of a sudden, these anchors are, frankly, a little less anchored. One stark example of this is Arizona State University, where half of the enrolled undergraduates now attend class online. The economic consequences of this for regions are obvious. If students and patients don't have to reside near or travel to anchor institutions for education or healthcare, students and patients' dollars won't travel either. Demographics. Demographics are another downside risk, though they have disparate impacts for universities and hospitals. With falling birth rates, fewer 18-year-olds are heading to college, and even fewer will enroll in the future, especially if immigration rates remain depressed, as they are now. The demographic shift is most apparent in the Northeast and the Midwest, which also happens to have the highest or higher concentrations of colleges and universities in the rest of the country. And I think that raises real questions. It raises real questions about the viability of many of these institutions in the future, and the impact, of course, that will have on their communities. On the other hand, an aging population is one that will require more health care boosting hospitals. Even here, the picture is mixed, as many hospitals have closed or soon will in rural regions with declining populations, and that's become a real crisis in many rural regions with the lack of health care. Meanwhile, the ever-rising cost of education and health care means that more people simply might be priced out of accessing eds and meds altogether, which is both a humanitarian concern and, of course, an economic one. And I think at this point it's obvious why the Fed, especially the Philly Fed in this case, is interested in anchor institutions. They are often the largest employers in their regions, they're the producers of talent that other businesses need, and they lay the foundation for durable economic growth. That's why at the Philadelphia Fed we've developed what we call the Anchor Economy Dashboard, a new tool that quantifies the impact that higher education institutions and hospitals have on more than 500 regions in the country. Now, for each of these regions, the dashboard calculates the total number of jobs, direct, indirect, or induced, supported by local eds and meds institutions. So what are these? Direct jobs, of course, comprise those employed directly by the anchor institutions, like doctors, nurses, and college professors. Indirect are those working in fields that directly support those anchor institutions, like IT contractors, for example, supporting a hospital or a university. And induced jobs are those that are supported by the economic activity that anchor institutions generate. You know, folks working these restaurants near campus on Tate Street have induced jobs. One thing that makes the Anchor Economy Dashboard so cool is that it also calculates a reliance index for each region. The reliance index provides a summary measure of how dependent a regional economy is on anchor institutions. It adjusts the economic impact by the size of the regional economy and incorporates measures of impact in terms of employment, income, and gross value added. Now, a reliance index of 1 means the region's reliance on anchor institutions is at the national average. Below means it's less reliant, of course, and above means it's more reliant. On a national scale, the dashboard clearly shows what I've been talking about. The economic impact of anchor institutions, when you combine them all together, is massive. 9% of total U.S. Unemployment, 6.7% of total U.S. income, and 8.1% of total U.S. gross value added is generated by higher education institutions and hospitals. That translates to 18.2 million jobs, $1.1 trillion in income, and $1.7 trillion in gross value added to the economy. This is an incredibly important sector for the U.S. economy. So let's do something I think really cool and take a look at a few of the 524 metro areas we have data for. And at this point, Deborah's going to drive the data.
Put my driving glasses.
She's going to put her driving glasses on. That's very important. So let's begin where we are, Greensboro. As we can see, in the Greensboro High Point area around 41,000 jobs and $2.3 billion in income and $3.3 billion in gross value added are produced by eds and meds. That equates to about 8.4% of the region's employment, 6.6% of its income, and 7.8% of its gross value added. Now, that sounds like the national average. Yes, all of this amounts to a reliance index of 0.98%. Let's call it 1. It's almost exactly the average for the country. Now, I know you don't think of yourselves as average. You're clearly above it. But in this case, it's the average of the country. Now, I think you'll see another cool feature of the dashboard, that it allows you to compare regions head to head. So you can look at your data, but also compare to other regions. So let's take a look at how Greensboro stacks up compared to two of its competitors, Greenville, South Carolina, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And thank you for not booing as I mentioned those names. As you can see, Greenville has slightly higher figures for employment, income, and gross value added compared to Greensboro. But its reliance index is basically on par with Greensboro at exactly average. Chattanooga has a significantly lower total figure and a lower reliance index. So let's take another stroll down the highway here and take a look at Durham, Chapel Hill area, just down I-40 from here. As we can see, these are some big numbers. More than 100,000 jobs, $7 billion in income, and over $10 billion in gross value added comes from local anchor institutions. That amounts to nearly a quarter of the area's jobs and more than a fifth of its income and gross value added. And you can imagine that means a pretty high reliance index. The area's reliance index is a truly eye-popping 2.86, nearly 3 times the national average. Lastly, because I'm a bit biased, let's take a look at Philly. So as you can see, I think we get Philly up there, the gross totals are large owing to the region's huge population. But the reliance index is above average too, indicating the Philly area is more reliant than most of the country on eds and meds. So I play around with this tool a lot, and I could do that all day, and I think many of you could as well. So if you go to our website, philadelphiafed.org, you have full access to this to play around with it. You know, and this is it's a tool that I think is really important in the beginning of a lot of work that Deborah's leading at the Philly Fed. This is incredibly important work in my mind to really understand the impact of these critical sectors of our economy. So Deborah's done fantastic work on this, so she's going to get all the hard questions. But the data now, the reason we started with the data, it serves as a foundation, right? It serves as a foundation for building lots of research on what's happening, and not just the research, but the critical conversations we need to have about the challenges and opportunities facing anchor-based economies. Again, there's an upside to that, being an anchor-based economy, but there's also potential downsides. So, in fact, we're going to start one of those conversations right now. So thank you again for having us, and we'll get at it. Thanks.
Well, thank you, President Harker. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Chancellor Frank Gilliam from UNCG. Dr. Frank Gilliam, Jr. began his tenure as the 11th Chancellor of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in September 2015. He's the first African-American chancellor to lead a non-HBCU in the UNC system. Chancellor Gilliam's career spans more than 39 years in higher education, including as Dean of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at UCLA, where his research focused on strategic communications, public policy, electoral politics, and racial and ethnic politics. He also was the University of California's first Associate Vice Chancellor for Community Partnerships, where he championed civic engagement and community-engaged scholarship. Dr. Gilliam has not only led UNCG to record growth, but has also helped build a solid foundation for a very bright future at the university. From the development of a new $105 million nursing and instructional building, to establishing Millennial Campus designation, which will drive public-private partnerships and economic development, to increasing diversity among faculty and leadership, and working with leaders on this campus and beyond on innovative student success initiatives, lauded by national foundations and press, and earning UNCG distinction as the best school in North Carolina for social mobility. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Gilliam.
Before we get started, I'd just like to welcome all of you to UNCG. Cecilia Thompson, thank you for your hard work in bringing folks here in the Philly Fed. Patrick and Diane, thank you very much. Appreciate all of you coming to little old Greensboro. I also want to recognize Kyle Farnbury, who's here. He's the president of Guilford College, which is also another one of the institutions in the area, and also to the Carolina Corps and the Piedmont Triad Partnership, who we do work with as well. So I'm done.
Well, no, don't say you're done.
I wanted
to start with you. I'm hearing your history at UCLA in directing partnerships there, and now your role here, and I know you've been involved in Campus Greensboro and others. I was wondering if you could describe both the motivations for establishing those external partnerships and maybe give us some examples of ones that you thought were particularly impactful.
Well, clearly here at UNCG, it's part of our mission. It has always been part of our mission really since our founding 130 years ago. I like to talk about the concept of shared fate, that we share a fate with Greensboro. In other words, as goes Greensboro, so goes UNCG, and as UNCG goes, so goes Greensboro. We have 88% of our alums stay in North Carolina. About 30,000 are within 25 miles of where we sit right now. So we are part of this community as a university. And I think what you said, Pat, you know, as I tell people, we're not going anywhere. And so our fate is indeed tied up. As you mentioned, Diane, in your opening remarks, we have received Millennial Campus designation by the UNC system, which the technical part is it exempts us from legislation around non-competition and allows us to enter into public-private partnerships, which is, you know, one of the things that, and I'm sure you've both dealt with it, that we have, if you're a public institution, is that there are regulations around how you build, how you spend your money, that do not constrain private entities. And so having an exemption from some of that's important. So we have a Millennial Campus designation that allows us to enter into public-private partnerships around two themes, the arts and culture and health, or health and wellness, along two corridors. And on the corner of Tate and Gate City, one of the main intersections around the campus, we are getting ready to build the Tannenbaum Center for Creative Practice. Jean Tannenbaum is here today, who's donated a generous gift for naming. It'll be a creative space for community engagement around creative activities, everything from TED Talks to installations to concerts. We're housing some of our programs there, arts administration, for example. But it's really meant to be at this interstitial place between where the campus theoretically ends and where the community begins. And so this is one example. We have a number of other examples that we're part of Metro Lab, which you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, a national network. We have something called the Center for New North Carolinians that really does remarkable work with immigrant and refugee communities here. And all of this is consistent with the kind of research we do around community engaged research. It's, oh gosh, when I was at UCLA, we were part of a group that tried to demonstrate to bigger research universities that there was value in community-engaged research, and that it was really a question of rigor, not a question of methodology. And here, I think we've found a way to employ that principle in how we evaluate our faculty. So as a result, they can do that kind of work. And the last thing I'll say is beauty of Greensboro, and different from my previous stint, was LA County had 88 municipalities. So you trying to be engaged in that community was tricky. Here, you have one county, and it is small enough that you can get your arms around it, but it's big enough that you can have scale, right? Which is what makes Campus Philly so impressive, is that they've done it in a much larger city. But we're here, we're engaged, our faculty's engaged, our students are engaged, and I was a little disappointed to see that we only had a 1 on your index. I thought with all the institutions in town, we'd maybe get a little higher than that.
President Harker, you have experience in building these partnerships as well. I don't know if you want to add something to these effective partnerships and what motivates them and what you did at University of Delaware.
So thanks, Deborah. And by the way, a 1 is not bad. So this is one of the things with this Reliance score. It just tells you where you are.
Well, we don't want to be average, Pat.
But
I don't accept that.
But that may be good in that you have a very diverse economy around you, right? And so if you look at, what is it, Cornell, Ithaca is
Ithaca is 3.71.
So it's
and
totally
if you think about
dependent on.
anything about Ithaca, that's it. Ithaca College and Cornell, and whereas a more diverse economy may be more stable. So, and that's a research question we have. We don't really know.
Question, right?
It's an
Yeah.
empirical
That's fair
question that we're
enough.
trying to understand.
Yeah,
So
it's an interesting project.
average is okay in this case. Yeah, so when I was at the University of Delaware, the University of Delaware is a unique institution in higher education in some ways. It is a private university with a public mission. It is the land-grant university of the state of Delaware, but it is a privately chartered university. And the reason for that, its roots go back to before the Revolutionary War, and so it's an unusual beast in that there are 32 trustees, 24 act like a private board. The governor gets to only appoint 8 of the trustees. So it is a unique model. So our first partnership with the university was literally with the state. And so the state, remember, Delaware is when I first arrived there, said to me, Pat, this isn't a state, it's a village. And everybody knows the state has less than 1 million people. It is population-wise very small. If it wasn't for Rhode Island, it'd be geographically the smallest. But we would beat up on Rhode Island because they were smaller. So the partnership with the state and the local community in terms of driving economic development was critical. And so I was very involved in the economic development activity. And then, of course, the Great Recession hit us, and the bottom fell out in many ways. The university was always strong in basically everything the DuPont family was interested in: science, particularly chemistry, chemical engineering, art history, art conservation. It has the top 3 art conservation program in the world. I mean, because of the legacy of the DuPonts and their commitment to the university and to the people in Delaware. But when the bottom fell out, right next door to us was an old Chrysler assembly plant that had started back during the Korean conflict, the Korean War, making Patton tanks, and then moved through the years making Chrysler vehicles. But it shuttered. It shut down. And that was devastating. And also the GM plant further up the road shut down. And that was devastating to the state, all those jobs, all those high-paying jobs. So it sat there for a while. And we were able, as a university, to acquire it. 272 acres, literally right across the street from the university, right on the Northeast Corridor with the Amtrak trains coming and going. And that partnership with the state in bringing businesses to that site, bringing technology-based businesses to that site, took some time, but it is now flourishing. I mean, you go to there now and you just see a whole new renaissance of what that campus could look like, as well as we moved some of our academic facilities down there, particularly around health sciences, and a lot, but it wouldn't have happened unless we had a deep understanding of partnership with the state and with the city we were part of. Because the city was very nervous about this, right? What was going to happen to this massive site that needed cleanup, and so we had to do the environmental remediation in parts of the site. But now, I think everybody looks at this as one of the greatest partnerships that had been pulled off in Delaware for a long time to revitalize the economy. And that's really important because people were lamenting the old, the auto industry was gone. It wasn't coming back. There were a couple failed attempts, more on the old GM site, to bring a couple of auto manufacturers in, and they failed. But what we finally decided to do is we can't live in the past, right? And this is a big part of these partnerships. What does our future look like? How do we drive to the future as opposed to trying to recreate the past? Recognizing the past, recognizing why it was important, but we're not going to recreate that. And so how do we create good jobs? Jobs not just for college graduates, four-year college degrees, but jobs for their manufacturing sites we brought on. Bloom Energy, they make hydrogen fuel cells. It's new technology, new jobs. And I think that, to me, the one lesson I took away from that is, at some point we have to say, the past is the past. We've got to move forward. And we've got to move forward together.
I want to dig a little deeper into this partnership question because obviously the institutions that you both have led or are talking about have interests of their own and how they want to grow and define their futures. You're also in a community, and we're in a room full of external partners who have their own interests in partnering with you. And they want certain things out of the partnership with the university. We want to keep your talent, or we want you to invest in this other initiative. So how do you set priorities? In other words, there are a lot of demands, right? So how do you set priorities, and maybe even how do you say no, and when do you say no, that the university is going to make this kind of external-facing community or economic development, but not this other kind? Is there a litmus test, or?
Well, there's a prime directive, and that is do no harm. That is, and I mean that seriously, in the sense that one of the great challenges with this work is that universities get accused of doing drive-by research, right? You use community partners for your research, and then you leave. So the second sort of principle is that universities have to build capacity in community. Third principle is that campuses have to respect community knowledge. I mean, I think that's one of the real tricks is that, and I say this, and with you I'm sure true, Pat, we're both longtime faculty members, and sometimes the faculty think that they're the only experts, and they devalue community knowledge. And I think you have to respect that. So if you build capacity with your partner, if it's a win-win, I mean, we're not in the charity business per se either, but it can't be that the institution is the only winner. So for us, I think we make sure we're not doing any harm, that we're valuing community knowledge, that we're asking our faculty in particular and our students to get something out of it, whether it's research, whether it's curriculum, whether it's experiential learning for the students. I mean, and whether or not it's critical workforce issues. Are we supplying a pipeline? So the when to say no is when those principles aren't met, right? For me at any rate, and I think for our institution.
No, so I agree. It has to be a win-win. I mean, the university has its mission. It has its students. It has its research mission. And so, but I agree that morphing that to really break down this barrier between faculty experts and community is vital. And I think it takes time to do that. And there are champions on a faculty that you can invest in who want to do that. They're already doing it. They want to do more of it. You can invest in them. And I think the community knows who they are because they're out in the community doing work. It's getting us, the administration, right, to know who they are and to champion their work as well. That's the job on the higher ed side. Same thing in healthcare. I mean, I think some healthcare institutions do an incredible job of community engagement, community involvement, but they're all under financial pressure at the same time. Particularly, as I said in my prepared remarks, COVID-19 has really whacked the healthcare industry big time. I mean, it is a major challenge, particularly, again, for those rural healthcare community systems. And so the community also has to be aware of the situation they're facing at the same time. Instead of saying, well, why aren't you doing this, this, and this for us? It really has to be a mutual understanding that, I'm having a hard time. I can't hire nurses. I can't pay them enough, and everything's costing more, and I can't pass those costs on given capitated care. I just can't pay the bills. So I think there has to be an understanding on both sides that what institutions can do, either the eds and meds or the community-based organizations. And once you have that honest dialogue and really understand where each of the groups are coming from, then you can make progress. But it has to be an honest dialogue.
I want to give a real-time example. I will change the names to protect the innocent. But we have a partnership in which the community did not trust any university. It's part of this strain of American thought that institutions of higher ed aren't to be trusted, right? I mean, since in our careers, that's changed dramatically, and public opinion polls data back that up. To make matters worse, the governing entity of this organization we were partnering with changed politically, and changed in a way that is not consistent with our mission. I'm trying to use euphemisms and other kinds of things to not get myself in trouble. But I mean, it's a real world, but the mission of the partnership, the real goal of the partnership and the benefits that are bestowed both on the community and on the campus were terrific. I mean, it was changing lives. But I guess the more formal way to say this is sometimes the external environment is such that you just can't have robust partnerships, even if the instrumentality of it's right, meaning what you're doing is the right thing to do. And it is hard to disentangle bad relationships. It's like life. It's hard to disentangle bad relationships. And if I'm going to use that metaphor, you keep going back to your ex, and then you find out that this isn't worth it. And you finally call it quits. My general counsel sitting up here saying what my client meant to say was but I mean, I'm trying to be candid about these things because it's we're right in the middle of this, trying to disentangle this thing and figure out how you can wind it down with grace, where both sides can leave with some dignity. And so the word you sort of implied, Pat, was trust. Yeah. And when that trust is broken or doesn't exist in the first place, it's very, very difficult to have a successful initiative.
Yeah.
Pat referred to changes on the landscape, disruptions even in higher education and healthcare as well. And I'm wondering whether one of the key interests of the Anchor Economy Initiative and the sort of first principle is that these institutions are in fact anchors. Maybe for both of you to weigh in on how that might be changing in the future, and what do you think are we going to see more consolidations? Are we going to see more schools close? And what will that mean to the anchor nature of institutions and the role that they've played in their communities?
Yeah, so I can tell you what we're seeing, I think Philadelphia nationally. As one of my contacts in higher education in the Philadelphia region put it to me recently, he's getting calls on a regular basis from smaller higher education institutions saying, just take us. You know, we can't do it anymore. Just acquire us, and we'll just become part of you. And there's another institution in the Philadelphia region who's pretty openly marketing themselves for such a merger. And we've already seen one such merger in Philadelphia. St. Joseph's University, the Jesuit university in Philadelphia, has essentially acquired, it's a merger, but essentially acquired the old Philadelphia Pharmacy, which was called the Philadelphia University of Sciences and Technology, to bolster their healthcare related fields. But they've become part of St. Joseph's University. On the flip side, Thomas Jefferson, which is a medical system in Philadelphia and university, acquired another local university, which was the old Philadelphia Textile, which was then called Philadelphia University. So you're seeing merger and acquisition activity happening across the higher education spectrum, just like you're seeing even in a more accelerated fashion in healthcare. I mean, healthcare, typically you're seeing the dominance of a few major players in every region. In Philadelphia, there's you might argue three major players that are dominating the healthcare space. And so that's going to continue because of the cost pressures, I think, just the simple fact of the cost pressures. And in the case of these anchor institutions, fortunately or unfortunately, depends on your perspective, their land in some cases is worth much more than they're able to generate out of tuition dollars and so forth. So they end up just selling the land or chunks of land. We're also seeing that. These smaller institutions are just chopping off pieces of themselves to sell. The problem with that, of course, is you run out of land sooner or later to sell. And so there's longer term structural issues about, again, we've got the demographic trends that we all know, the demographic cliff that we're hitting in higher education. That combined with the immigration of international students has started to tail off some, and it depends on the region. On the other hand, it's actually growing for some institutions that we're hearing from who have reached out in different parts of the world. So one such institution I know of has slowly, carefully built a brand in different parts of Africa and where the young are. And it's starting to attract more and more students from Africa to their university. So there are different approaches people are taking all across the country, but this relentless push to reduce cost to survive, both in the eds and the meds, will continue. I don't see that ending anytime soon.
Well, as somebody who's living through it, I couldn't agree more, but we've seen this here in Greensboro where one of the institutions is really, and a very historic and legacy-driven institution is on the brink. We've been approached by various kinds of institutions. One of the other things that is driving all this on the ed side is a change in consumption patterns. By that I mean, we're finding increasingly that people are choosing just not to go to college. For example, I don't know, 5 years ago, only 100 of our admits didn't go to another institution. In this year's class, 500 didn't go. So that knows they didn't come here, but they didn't go to another school. Yeah. They just didn't go to college. And that is a national trend. partially, I think, given, well, several things driving it. One, people valuing the ROI. Two, today's students are extremely debt averse because we've had the narrative around the student loan crisis that I think has really influenced people's behavior. So I think it's going to require us, and as I've told our campus, to do two things. One is to innovate. You know, I've always complained that most American universities are, you know, 18th century models of 17th century European universities. Right. And who said you need 15 or 16 weeks in a semester? Where's that rule come from? And we know where it started. But is that a good thing? How we offer our courses. I'm not saying we cave to the online retailers, but there are, you know, you have to look around and say we can't keep doing things the same way. So we have to innovate our way out, and by the way, partnerships may be one of the ways, and we have to reinvent ourselves. That is, we have to change how we do business. And I think that's the only way that you'll remain robust if you innovate and reinvent. And for state schools, in a system like ours, we have 16 universities in our system in North Carolina. I mean, that's a lot of schools, let alone a bunch of private. So I suspect we'll see some closures.
One thing, if I could add, because you brought up something which at the Philly Fed we're conflicted about, in the sense that on one hand, you know, the access to college access, critically important for this country. At the same time, not everybody's going to go to college. So how do we get them the skills they need to move into good, solid middle-class jobs? So I'm going to give a shout out to another line of work that we have done at the Philly Fed, along with some of our partners across the Federal Reserve System, on what we call opportunity occupations. These are jobs that don't require a four-year college degree. They require something after high school, right? But not where you can earn above median wages. That is, these are jobs, good jobs that will move you into the middle class. And we actually have a tool on our website called the Occupational Mobility Explorer. And I love this tool. You can go on and say, what skills do I have now? And if I wanted, and what jobs would be available to me with the current skill set I have with a little bit of training. And it actually lets you then go 2 more steps. And if I do that, what could I do next? And if I do that, what could I do next? It's a very powerful tool because in addition to having, give a good example of what's happening in Philadelphia and why I bring this up. Because of the research that came out of, continues to come out of the University of Pennsylvania around cell and gene therapy, particularly for cancer, and the faculty there invented mRNA technology that underlies all the successful COVID-19 vaccines and really is going to be the technology of the vaccine of the future. The city is bursting at its seams. I talked a little bit about this on wet lab space. Biotech pharma companies from around the world are trying to locate in Philadelphia and the region. So they need a lot of biology majors, PhDs, but they also need a lot of lab techs, right? And a lab tech is a good, solid entry job into a good, solid middle-class life. And I think that's an area that we're very focused on. We need higher ed. We need higher ed to be strong. But we also have to recognize at the same time, not everybody's going to go to college, and we need the diversity of the workforce and the skill set that underpins all of economic development. Because if we don't have solid middle-class jobs, if we can't bring people and their families into a level of stability, right, then the communities suffer and we as a nation suffer. So we're very, very committed to both this work that we're doing for eds and meds, but at the same time recognizing not everybody's going to go to college. We need to provide pathways to success there too.
Pat, do you think, well, so one, community colleges sort of play that role, but we know they've had significant declines in enrollment. Do you think four-year institutions can do that by offering certificates?
Yeah, good question.
Training labs, that sort of thing, or are we out of that business?
I think
Sorry to ask.
no, no.
I'm going to start.
No, it's a good
questioning
question. So I really think it depends on the local market. In fact, there is a conversation going on right now in Philadelphia with some of the four-year institutions, some of the anchors, about how do we meet this need for the lab techs and other jobs that are emerging out of this booming industry. And so, no, I think four-year institutions, and there's a couple ways of doing this, right? We've seen in our market some four-year institutions acquire essentially community colleges and add them under their umbrella. In one case, it was a state institution in New Jersey that did this recently, and some others have thought about doing this. In other cases, it may mean just offering certificate programs, right? Non-degree certificate programs, which we're also big fans of, just skill acquisition. So I think four-year institutions can absolutely do this. The challenge, as you know, from a leadership position and what you've accomplished here is sometimes convincing the faculty this is a good idea.
Well, we're in this debate right now because just a couple buildings over, we have an esports facility that's extremely popular, and you may know that Epic Games, which is a premier game company in the world, is about 40 miles away. And they've developed something called Unreal Engine. You got to be like 22 to understand this stuff. That's why I call my son all the time and ask him. But it is the underlying 3D platform for Meta. And I don't even know Meta, or from Meta, or to Meta. But I know it's a thing, and it's going to be a thing, and we're trying to position ourselves to be an Unreal Engine training site.
Oh, cool.
So we could offer certificate. And as you commented, some parts of the university don't see the value in that. But we're training our faculty and our students. It's central, from what I understand, to any industry. Industry's using it for all kinds of things, from real estate, because you can image it a whole development, to entertainment, to so on. So my point, to your point, it's can we sort of align ourselves with skill-based initiatives? Can we sell it on the campus, and the industry partners are very interested because they need employees, and it's skill, it's not a degree, so.
Yeah, I'm curious from these kinds of innovations that potentially bring more students into your campus, right? So you're addressing this sort of viability of they meet workforce needs in the region. For a state-supported, state-funded institution, is that a plus? Does state funding provide a runway for that kind of innovation, or the opposite?
Well,
maybe?
what's been interesting is we've sort of treated it as a startup, and so we had no state funding, except it turns out the chair of the House Appropriations Committee is a gamer, and this, what they say in golf, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And so he has supported us, but we had already built the facility with private partners, and we had already started a number of initiatives with private partners. So and it's not part of our university state appropriation. I mean, we won't get that. So that's why we have to innovate. And I talk about low entry barriers. We'll have to get into things where it doesn't cost us a lot to get there.
The data that we looked at showed that higher ed institutions and hospitals are huge employers. You're obviously also the producers of talent. So you're leading an organization that also needs talent. So putting that hat on, are you collaborating with the other universities and colleges in Greensboro to sort of bring on talent that you need to run the university? Do you see that trend of an ecosystem developing where talent is being used? And then I know we looked at data when I was at Campus Philly, and the University of Pennsylvania was the largest employer of recent grads. I mean, they might eventually then leave the city or go to graduate school or whatever, but that was a significant employer for recent grads.
Well, I don't know where Cecilia is. She's almost in many ways better able to answer that question than I am, because that's part of our problem here has been getting graduates to stay in Greensboro. I mean, it's easier, I think, to get them to stay in Philadelphia. This is a very family-oriented town, so we're getting a lot. I forget what they call them. They're coming back.
Boomerangs.
Boomerangs. They're coming back because they're now married with kids and find out they can live here and you can't live in New York or even Philadelphia, and they can good schools and homes. So our problem is keeping our graduates here. We have 5 higher ed institutions, and the bigger challenge for us in terms of staffing the university is that we have 16 schools in the system, and when everybody starts to need staffing, it rolls downhill or uphill, however you want to describe it, that people start poaching. So there is an ecosystem, but it's a poaching ecosystem, right? I mean, somebody poaches from us, we poach from somebody else. And in the end, I don't think it's a good thing, right, for any of us. But that's where we are. We're all having great difficulty finding people. And it's, you know, one of the things we haven't talked about is the changing nature of the labor market, right? And it's partially, I think, in large part caused by the pandemic, that people have reevaluated their lives. We've been talking about, you talked in your talk about remote learning. 12 years ago, we couldn't have done that. The technology wasn't there. For any of you who used early Skype, it was awful, right? And you couldn't do all the stuff we do now. I mean, in Zoom, we just take it for granted, right? But that's changed the way we live and work. It's changed the way we teach here on the campus. And we're trying to figure out the consequences or the implications of it, right? People are leaving us to take jobs in they can go live anywhere and still work remotely. My daughter lives in DC, but she works remotely, 100%, essentially 90%. So the changing labor market both hurts us in terms of staff, but I think is really going to affect how students approach college. So, and I think you guys are at the Fed. You need to tell us what the hell's going on. I don't know what's going on. Come on, Pat. Give us some insight here.
Yeah, I wish we had a crystal ball for this. I mean, it really is, in real time, we're experiencing this change that we don't quite understand where the end game is. You know, I tell you, the people who are completely, paranoid about this, and appropriately so, are commercial real estate owners. And it's a big sector of our economy. Office buildings are empty or near empty. We're converting office space in Philadelphia to lab space in some cases, or apartment space. Nobody really knows what that future of work is going to be. But at the same time, young people in some cases young employees are starting to realize, nobody ever really sees me. And so I think we have to step back and recognize we are human beings, right? We haven't, even though the pandemic and technology has changed a lot, we haven't changed all that much. We evolved very slowly, and we still need that social interaction. We still, the serendipity happens in a hallway or over a coffee. Those things are real to us. And one of the concerns that's being expressed by people who are in the human resources field and so forth is that what happens to those young people who never get seen, right? Never have those moments, never get mentored in that way. What happens to their careers? And that's a real concern. So I think the jury is still out on what that future of work is going to look like going forward. And companies all across the country, we're struggling with it. Every organization I know is struggling with this. But it also has a very, very, very real impact on local communities and economic development. A few weeks ago, I spent the day in the state capital in New Jersey, Trenton, and meeting with small business owners. You know, the state workers were all working from home. That's 20,000 workers in Trenton who are not coming in, going to the dry cleaner, the deli, et cetera. That has a devastating impact on those small businesses. So their one plea is, please go tell the governor to bring everybody back. And you understand it, right? So I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we're not done this yet. It's going to continue to evolve for a while.
I'm just curious about, you're talking about, I'm curious about the effect you would speculate on higher ed in particular, where collegiality and gathering and all of that's extremely socialization of people, young people to habits and work habits and all that knowledge and all that stuff.
I mean, and you know this far better than I, what's one of the biggest crises facing higher ed is student mental health. And I don't think it's getting any better by being isolated in front of a screen somewhere. And so this is one thing I think we as a society need to step back and say, what's best for the mental health of the next generation? And let's design this system and figure out how. It's much more cost effective for me to hire that person where they sit in their little apartment and just code, right? But what is the long-term implication for their mental health? Again, we don't really understand that. But I think that has to, when we step back from all the challenges we face, that crisis, that mental health crisis, is really significant, not just economically, because it decreases the productivity of the American economy over time, but it's just simply something we've got to fix as people to help people be healthy.
I think we're ready to take some questions from the audience. So I see Cecilia has a mic, but if you have a loud voice, I think you
Scream away.
And could you tell us who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, that'd be great.
My name is Carly Omlabar, and I'm with the William C. Schumacher Family Foundation in Lafayette, Louisiana. I was curious if you could speak to the index that you created, and it seems like, and of course I just pulled it up on my phone for a minute or two, but it seems like it doesn't account for the cottage industries around eds and meds, and if you could talk about that and how, because I almost feel like that goes to the weight of the one that, our esteemed head of the university is not excited about, but if you've got a really robust supplementary economy around it. So if you could speak to that.
Right, so this is step one. And Deborah, go ahead. The data's there, right?
Yeah, so the Reliance Index measure it's an average of 3 other kind of scores. One on how concentrated is employment in your region in eds and meds, how concentrated is income in your region in eds and meds, and how concentrated is gross value added. And those 3 averaged together creates the Reliance Index. You're right that when we're looking at regions, and when we're looking at a region like Philadelphia, and I think we were both a little surprised that Philadelphia was 1.4, because really Philadelphia seems like almost exclusively an eds and meds city. But when you're talking about the spin-offs, maybe this is what you meant by cottage industries. We have Spark Therapeutics, we have Biogen, we have these pharmaceutical, life science, cell and gene technology companies that are spin-offs. Their origins are in the research and practice of the university and the hospital, but then they're in a different sector. They're counted in a different sector. So on the one hand, the innovation is spurred by that 1.4 Reliance Index, but the outcome gets counted in some other industry sector. One thing that we are very eager to do is to look at the supply chain that feeds into eds and meds in a region, which we can do with this data set, and understand as another opportunity for economic impact. There are going to be some regions where It's local businesses that are supplying the eds and meds with their goods and services. And in some regions, we know, we already saw it in State College, they're getting very few of their goods and services that they need to run the university from their regional economy. So that's an opportunity to leverage the university, the hospital, for local companies, for them to become the sort of customers of those locally grown companies. So these are all things that we, in the future, get to look at.
Yeah, step one, more to come.
Hey everyone, I'm Carla Kodanian with the Birmingham Business Alliance, Birmingham, Alabama. So we have an anchor institution as well, the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Fits, all of these were 1.2, I looked it up as well. But we're an economic development organization that serves the region, and what can EDOs do to better support our anchor institution?
So again, I go back to my experience at Delaware. We were joined like this because it's a small place. But I think economic development organizations could first understand what the university's about, what they're trying to accomplish, and where their strengths are, right? Peter Drucker, the old management guru 101, lesson one, always play to your strengths. Find the areas you're strong and just push on those. And I think sometimes in different contexts I've had experience where the economic development organizations really don't understand what the university's good at or what they want to be good at and what they're investing in. And that takes some time to sit down with the institution, and then you can start to wrap around that investments that the EDO wants to make that are really tied to where the university's going. Sometimes they're orthogonal. They're just so disconnected from each other that that's not going to succeed. Particularly given a strong anchor institution like you have, you really need to get their strategy. And at the same time, on the institution, the university side, or the health system side, you need to they need to understand what the community is trying to do at the same time.
Just one word I would respond with, which is intentionality. My experience has been there's people just sort of wait and hope that it will happen, as opposed to really drive towards specific outcomes. And that applies to both the university and it applies to economic development organizations.
Good point. Good word.
My name is Marcus Thomas with the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, also a current student here at UNCG in the MPA program. She almost took my question, but I really want to know, how can philanthropic organizations and foundations support the work of anchor institutions to continue to drive economic development and impact?
Go ahead, Al.
Hey, he's your student, man.
Well, I know, I'm just looking to see if I have any local funders in the room.
Good move, good move. So again, I think those private foundations, I say the same thing. I use the example, again, back to my days at Delaware. There were several major foundations, pretty much all spawning out of the DuPont family. Remember, the DuPont family back in the day was the wealthiest family in the world. Yeah. And so they created these tremendous foundations. But one in particular that was solely dedicated to funding the university. We would sit down with them every year and we'd negotiate, we'd talk. And that's important, right? We talk about what they want to accomplish, what we want to accomplish, and where they intersect. And then say, okay, that's the stuff we're going to drive forward. That's the intentionality. But I think it really does come down to not just throwing money over the wall and seeing what sticks, but it's really sitting down and hearing what each other want to do, what you think is important, and be open-minded to learn from each other. There were things that foundation pushed us to do that we didn't necessarily think was high priority, but they were right in some cases. And so it has to be an open dialogue on both sides.
Andrea Sheets, Forsyth County Workforce Economic Development. Our reliance index is about 1.9, and we do have a very young, highly educated population. But I was wondering, in the research around that, if there's any trends with student debt and home ownership, mobility, wealth building, anything that you've seen.
Can you say again where you were from exactly?
Next county over. Winston-Salem.
So there's a third stream of work going on at the Philly Fed, headed by one of our economists, Dubravka Ritter, that is very focused on higher education finance and student debt. And they just put out a really important report recently on the unintended consequences of some of what happens in the student debt world. We think we're helping particularly low-income and underserved communities by doing it. In many cases, it tends to be in many cases, our model of higher education financing in this country really is subsidizing the upper middle class to wealthier communities. It's not, because of various things we do, and the one they pick out most importantly is when you fill out that FAFSA form, families don't have to put down their house, for example, as an asset. That's off the books. Well, home ownership, we know, within certain communities of color is low. And so in some ways it hurts them by not having to do that. So we have a whole line of research on higher education financing, student debt. There's no question, and we have other work that has been done. It slows household formation, family formation, small business formation. This is some work that came out a while ago now. Because how am I going to, the standard line, I remember one of my colleagues from Wharton when I was there teaching entrepreneurship, he would give students advice. When I became dean, I would cringe at this advice, like, no, don't say that to the students. We've all had this experience. He would tell them, go and grab every application you can for a credit card and apply to every credit card you can get right now. Because that's how you're going to fund your startup. Because you don't have any other way of getting funding, so you're going to do it off a credit card, which is a really bad idea. But his point was right. Like, if I'm going to start a small business, I need to get some seed capital. And often, but if I'm already loaded down with student debt, I can't get it because I've got this debt that's hanging over me. So the long-term issue about student debt, and again, it's a deep issue because it's not just buying a house, but it's even, some evidence about it's just family formation. I can't afford, or I don't feel comfortable starting a family because I have got all this hanging over me. That is a real drag on the American society. And the solution to that is not obvious, right? It's not obvious. And this is the work we're trying to do, because you'd think, well, just do student debt forgiveness. Again, let me triple down on my disclaimer. I'm not telling other parts of the government what to do or not do, but we are trying to understand the economic implications of that. That sounds great, but then what happens next year? It's not solving the fundamental problem of access to higher education, because it's just kicking the can down the road, and at some point, we run out of cans. You just can't keep doing that.
Chancellor Gilliam, do you think the state legislature understands that they're funding your institution in some sense reduces student debt for, what did you say, 85% of your students stay in the state for future residents who are going to buy houses and start business? Do they understand that cycle, and how do you explain that to them?
Now you're just trying to get me in deep kimchi here.
Should we ask who's in the room before you?
Yeah, well, you're taping it in this live stream, so it's not helping me out much. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, higher education's fate. I had a state legislator. I can say it. I had a state legislator once, a chair of an appropriations committee at the time in Delaware, who had a meeting with him before our budget hearings, and because we would get subsidy from the state, we were the land grant for the university, although it was this strange governance model. And he said, "Look, you know, you have to understand, we're under a crunch here. This was in the Great Recession. I've got to fund K-12. And so you got to go raise tuition." So we go into the public hearing, and he excoriates me for raising tuition, which I understood. It's just the way the system works, right? It's not, I wasn't blaming him, but higher ed, often when states get crunched, it's easy to cut back on higher ed because you got all these, you got prisons, you got K-12, you got Medicare, Medicaid, you've got these other things that you've got to fund as a state. And so, again, I think we need to really rethink of the structure of how we're financing higher education in America. And that's some of the work, again, we're trying to lead at the Philly Fed, is because it is an incredible burden for the American people to not be able, again, whether it's a four-year college degree or even that certificate program. We need we desperately need a highly skilled, educated workforce. Whatever that skill is, whether it's an electrician or a carpenter or a PhD in microbiology. We need this. This is the lifeblood of America. I mean this in a very real way. I mean, we are not going to be the low-cost anything in producing stuff in the world. That's not the American model. What we are is the most innovative country in the world. And that innovation starts with the workers we have, the skills of the people. And once we lose that edge, and we cannot afford to lose that edge.
What I will say here in North Carolina, to the legislature's credit, they subsidize at a rate much higher than most states. When I was in California, I think it was 8 or 9%. Here it's around 30%. So that's pretty generous. But on the other hand, and it's good for, the second point is good for access, which is that they've held tuition flat for 6 years in a row. Wow. The problem with that is it squeezes the institution's ability to deliver on the core mission. And the sense, and particularly given inflation in the last few years, even we have a $81 million renovation of our library that we got passed a year or two ago, and now it's the cost. Inflation is 30% on capital costs. So what was an $81 million renovation in true form looks like a $51 million renovation. So I mean, so point is that they've done a pretty good job to their credit here, keeping tuition flat and subsidizing the state. You know, there's only a few people that can pay, right? It's either the families, the state, or the universities. Right. So, you know, you sort of do the math on that one.
Right.
If you've held it flat for the families, and the state's sort of stopped, has generous appropriations, was not giving any more. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the public regionals, like us, like a UAB, like I mean, they're the ones that get squeezed.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you know, certainly privates like Penn don't have a concern, but a school like Temple does in Philadelphia.
Very much so.
And you can think of your own states where you have public regionals. Typically, your flagship campus, for the most part, will be okay, right? But it's the others that are really going to suffer. And then this goes back to the conversation we had about, you know, consolidation and all of that sort of business, because the schools just won't be able to afford it. You know, when you and I started in this business, a public university, the state subsidized at 85%.
Yeah.
85. So if you were a college president, you just had to, you know, talk to the alumni and hire some faculty and go to, you know, cocktail parties at the football games. But now it's quite different for university administrations in terms of what you have to do. And this your study of higher ed financing will be interesting because it's the shifting cost between those three sectors, and where is equilibria, you know, where everybody sort of comes out okay. And we, you know, when you're at like at UCLA where I was, they get 9 or 8% state support, but they generate $1 gazillion in research money,
Right.
and so they don't need it, right? I mean, I don't know what their number is. And then they have $6 billion capital campaign.
Right.
It's a different story for schools like ours.
Yeah, yeah.
And most schools look like us.
Yep. The vast majority of American students go to a school
look
like
like us, look
Yeah.
like UAB, look like Louisiana Monroe.
Yep.
That's the one from Lafayette, or Louisiana Lafayette. I mean, and to me, that's the secret sauce. If you want to talk about rebuilding the middle class, those are the institutions
Yep.
that are going to rebuild your middle class.
I agree.
Because they're going to, here we're going to have accountants and chemists and teachers and nurses and,
Yep.
you know, I mean, imagine we train in the MBA program, maybe this young man over here will be a hedge fund manager, but that's not our main thing of our business school. Right, so.
We have time for one more question? No? All right. Well, then join me, please, in thanking Chancellor Gilliam and President Harker for this great conversation.
And they have a big anchor